Thank you, Jenny. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'd like to thank Jenny Bergenmeyer for inviting me. The project that I'm going to talk about is a project that I started in 2012, and it's going on. It still has a lot of potential to continue, and we want to extend some of the potential that we've built into it. But what I want to show you is the whole concept and also illustrate the concept with the prototype that we have. We hope to publish the final archive in early 2016. I don't want to set a definite date because I've been postponing several times now. So it was supposed to be in May for the conference, and then in October, and I'm still struggling to finish the revision, and my colleague who's doing the computer programming is struggling to integrate all the different branches of the code so that it really works as we've planned. So it will take some time before we are able to really show that we didn't find a solution for this problem. But so let me guide you through the project so that you see that we are coming from traditional literary studies background, but at the same time we are trying to rethink what we can do by editing texts and analyzing texts and making texts machine readable with approaches coming from digital humanities and humanities computing. So I'm going to try to explain what I call the simulative logic of this project, which I think sets it apart from most literary archives as they've been conceived and designed so far. So I will start just by calling attention to what we are doing here in this archive, that it's specific, that it's not been attempted in quite the same way that we are trying to do. So the question that it's not, these questions have not been posed like this, but whenever I present a project, and I've done it to different communities, to the scholars of Fernando Pessoa, to the Ti XML encoding community, to people who work with cooperative computing and machine learning, also to more traditional literary scholars in the field of textual editing. I sense some discomfort when they see the project, and these questions, I think, address some question marks that I see in the faces of the audiences when they look at the project and they don't quite understand the fact that we are creating an archive where people can change the archive now, and they can remix the archive. So I'm going to try to explain that. So what are you doing to scholarly editing? Now, that's a question that I see in some faces. Well, most scholarly editing so far has been an attempt to find a way of presenting an edition that is better than the previous editions. And most scholarly editing in digital media has continued that kind of logic. Now, we want to make an edition that is more sophisticated, that is more complete, that is more thorough, that is more exhaustive than previous editions. When I submitted this project, I decided that I would have a different approach. Now, I call this approach a meta-editorial approach. So I'm not so much interested in producing an edition that says this is better than what's been done before, but what I want to do is to present an edition that allows us to learn about the editorial process itself. So instead of looking for more accurate and more exhaustive representations of texts from the past. Then the other question is, what are you doing to digital archives? Digital archives have been almost the standard form of publishing collections of works or large corpora of works in digital media. And the idea of the archive is really to create an environment that brings together digital representations of texts that might be separate in different libraries and archives. And so the digital surrogates create a new kind of environment, where we can see facsimiles, authenticated facsimiles of different kinds of originals, manuscripts, printed texts that may be scattered. And what the project does is remediate those materials, thinking of remediation itself as a dynamic process rather than a mere representation. And so I'm trying to develop an archive that I call a dynamic remediation, which is a contradiction in terms with the idea of archive. But actually I use the word archive because that's the word that was available when I started, but I really think that I need a new word that I have not really found to describe what I'm doing here. Finally, and this is a question that I see on the faces of the Pessoa scholars, what are you doing to the Book of Disquiet? No. Again, the Book of Disquiet, I will talk more in detail about it, is one of Fernando Pessoa's major works. It was only published for the first time in 1982, and it's become since then one of the defining moments of Portuguese modernism and actually of European modernism. And although people realize the importance of the work, and everyone tends to think of important works as those works that continue to be read, continue to be published, and so continue to be meaningful after many generations. And I think that what we are doing, again, is not competing with editors of the Book of Disquiet, with the ones who published different versions of this work before. I simply say that what we are doing is making the Book of Disquiet machine readable. And by making it machine readable, we are bringing it to the 21st century. And in a way, we are also reinforcing the idea that it continues to be meaningful. And if it's a modernist classic, it's a modernist classic now in the sense that machines will be able to read it as well. So that's my three questions. All of these questions, as I said at the beginning, are implicit questions, no? Because I see in different constituencies a certain uneasiness about this project, and I'm trying to explain how the project really comes from the tradition of editorial and textual criticism, but it's thinking of digital editing in a different way. It also is placed within the genealogy of digital archives, but is looking at the archive as a dynamic remediation. And it's also placed within the tradition of the editions of the work of Fernando Pessoa, but is thinking about how can we make this work readable for the kinds of reading tools that we use today, like computer programs. these are the ultimate goals of the project. I don't know if we will succeed in achieving this, but we are trying. No, the title of the project, as Jenny said, is "No Problem as a Solution." So I'm not claiming that we've found a solution, but this is where we are at and where we want to be in the end. So we want to have a theoretical approach that goes beyond current representational and repositorial models. We think that most archives tend to take an approach that is strongly fixated in fetishizing the object, in fetishizing the facsimile, in fetishizing the accurate transcription, rather than thinking of or thinking about what can we do once we have a digital representation of a text. What can we do with it that we couldn't do before? And finally, the other major goal is to establish the L2D archive, the Book of Disquiet archive, as an archive that is also an example of what digital humanities can do. So it's an example of a project that brings together state-of-the-art tools, and these are some of the fields that have been contributing to the archive: text encoding, text analysis, data mining, machine learning, cooperative computing, electronic literature, data visualization. So there will be components in the archive that have been developed with contributions from ideas and tools and programming coming from all of these fields. And we want to think of the archive, or redesign the archive, as a participatory and simulative environment for research, learning, and creativity. So those are the ultimate goals of the archive. So now let me take you through the two major aspects, I think, of the archive: the representational and the scholarly aspect on the one hand, and the simulative, participatory, role-playing aspect on the other hand. Well, this is a quote from an article by Peter Robinson about digital critical editions, and it summarizes an idea, I think, that is the standard practice today when thinking about scholarly editing, not just in digital terms, but generally. And I think the claim Peter Robinson is making here is that when we design digital archives, we have also to incorporate, to integrate these goals, these principles. So he says, we may only know the text through the documents we read, and we may only communicate any text we make through the documents we create. But every time we look from one document to another, or look away from the document to consider what we have read, or try to express what we think we are reading, we look to the work, shadowy but omnipresent. One cannot know the work without the documents. Equally, one cannot understand the documents without a comprehension of the work they instance. From this, a principle appears. A scholarly edition must, so far as it can, illuminate both aspects of the text, both text as work and text as document. And in fact, when we look at the Book of Disquiet in the major editions that have been published, the major critical editions, we see these dialectics between work and document at play, because each editor has to work with a certain idea of what the work is, to organize the fragments of the work, of the documentary, the documentary fragments. And so the reading of those fragments and the selection and the sequencing and the construction of the book has to be made with an idea of what the work is, of what the author intended the work to be, of what I think as editor the work should be. So this is what I call the representational logic of textual editing. But then there's another logic that I've tried to bring into this archive, which is the simulation logic. And here I quote Jerome McGann, was an inspiring author for my intellectual development, and in particular for thinking about new ways of editing. This is an article McGann published in 2006, but these ideas we find in his work since the 1990s, when he started to work in the Rossetti archive. Quote, "But suppose in our real-life engagements with those physical objects, we experience them as social objects, as functions of measurements that the users and makers have chosen for certain particular purposes. In such a case, you will not want to build a model of one made thing. You will try to design a system that can simulate all the realized and realizable documentary possibilities. The possibilities that are known and recorded, as well as those that have yet to be reconstructed." So McGann here is arguing for the possibility of building something that is not a model of a specific object, but is a system for simulating certain possibilities. And that is the approach, I think, that ultimately lies behind the concept of the Book of Disquiet archive, to have this simulation embedded into the material and technical aspects of the archive. So now let's go through the project. So this is a project that was funded, has been funded for the last 3.5 years. It's coming to an end now. It's a project of the Center for Portuguese Literature, and it has also the collaboration of the Institute for Systems and Computer Engineering, Research and Development in Lisbon. The computational part of the archive has been coordinated by António Rito Silva, a colleague of mine. And we also have the collaboration of the National Library of Portugal, which is the institution that houses the papers of Fernando Pessoa, and who gave us, they gave us access to the facsimiles and to all the materials. So this will be the future address, URL of the archive, l2d.uc.pt. It's still not open, but it will be open in the future. And now another question: what is the Book of Disquiet? We may describe the Book of Disquiet in two ways. One way is to say that it is an authorial project. And as an authorial project, it's an unfinished and unorganized work written between 1913 and 1935. The textual sources that we use and for transcription and encoding are the total sum of the texts of the 4 scholarly editions that we are also representing. So we are not making decisions about which texts, which fragments belong in the book. We are simply saying that we have these 4 editions, and when we bring them all together, we have this set of texts. And so we are considering the texts that have been ascribed to the book by the 4 editors. The Book of Disquiet may be described also as an editorial construct, in the sense that Pessoa never finished the work, he never decided on a final sequence, on a final selection. The texts that compose the work are in various stages of completion. Some are rough drafts, some are clean drafts, some are typescripts. So there's a whole process of writing in progress that we find when we go to the papers and look at the several hundred fragments of the book. So in the context of our archive, we are representing transcriptions from authorial sources. We describe them as authorial sources. So we have the facsimiles, and we have what we call a topographic transcription. So a transcription that represents the distribution on the page with the line breaks, with spaces in between paragraphs. It's a roughly topographic. We are not mimicking all topographic aspects, but only those two aspects. And then we have a series of editions which we call expert editions. And these are the four major critical editions of the book, published between 1982 and 2010. Now, another question. What is the Book of Disquiet if we look at it as an authorial project? It is a set of manuscript and typescript texts. The National Library has catalogued 722 sheets as belonging to the Livro do Desassossego, of which 374 are typescripts and 348 are manuscripts. It's also a set of printed texts, because Pessoa published 12 fragments, 12 texts in his lifetime. So these texts appeared in 1913 and then in 1932 in several literary magazines. What is the book? No, let me just show you an example of the writing process in the manuscripts. So this is an example. This is an extremely difficult example. So the writing is scattered, and we can find all these bits of writing in different directions. So the writing, the occupation of the field of the page tells you the sequence of writing. And you can see that this type of structure poses problems in terms of even ordering within this specific text, or deciding if this is only one text or two texts. So this is what I call the kinetics of writing, so a way of representing the motions of writing around the page. Another representation. So the page that we are looking at is that one, but this is also the context of the page with the bifolio and what other fragments are around this. Well, I have to tell you that not all fragments are like this. This is one of the most complicated, but anyway, there are difficult issues when we have to decide the structure, the internal structure of the document. Then, what is the Book of Disquiet as an editorial construct? We are working with 4 editions. We have decided on these editions because all of these editors have worked with the originals, so they are critical editions in a certain sense. So they have a minimum critical apparatus. Only one of the 4 actually has a very extensive, detailed critical apparatus. And so I guess for some people, only that would qualify as a fully critical edition. But the other 3 also have critical apparatus, have introductions that explain the criteria for ordering, etc. So these are the 4 expert editions. The first one was published in 1982 by Jacinto do Prado Coelho. The second, and consists of 520 numbered pieces. The second edition was published in 1990 and 91, also in 2 volumes, by Teresa Sobral Cunha. Contains 724 unnumbered texts, arranged chronologically. The third edition was published in 1998 by Richard Zenith. consists of 533 numbered pieces. And finally, the fourth edition, the critical and genetic edition, was published by Geronimo Pizarro in 2010. And if you look at the square brackets, you see that every edition has continued to change. No? Actually, this is one feature that has not changed about the book of Disquiet. Every edition is different. So even the critical editors, when they reissue an edition, they go back and they change. Sometimes it's just readings of particular passages. Sometimes it's one text, a new text that comes in, or a text that goes out. So the number of texts in each edition also varies slightly. But, well, except for the first edition, and I think the first edition never changed because the editor died. No? Otherwise, it would continue to change. But the other three editions are still alive, no? In the sense that they are continuing to change. And one of the problems that we have is, in terms of our own decisions about which version to encode, is that we have to set for a particular version, and the editors, I've worked with them, and they always want the latest version because they think that's the one that's more correct, more accurate. But because they've, like when we started in 2011, we decided to use all the versions that we had until then, but new versions have appeared. And so one of the things they're expecting from us is that we update the transcriptions and the encoding that we have to reflect the new versions. I'm not sure that we can do that, no, because it's such time-consuming task to encode all the variations. So just to give you an example, these are the pages that corresponds to that handwritten text that we saw earlier. So if you go back, so if you look at this left-hand image here, you will see that this is the way it's been edited. This is the first edition. So you see that there are problems of in reading particular passages. There are also problems in deciding the relative order of paragraphs in some cases. So a certain level of interpretation has to go to decide that. There are also questions of defining the texts. No, if it's only one text, if it's two texts, no, because at one point there's what looks like a title for a fragment, and so in some cases this is only one fragment, this is two fragments, and here what we have here is at the scale of one text the problem that is the same at the scale of the entire work. You have to decide. There are problems of deciphering the handwriting, and so over the years new readings have been offered, and generally more accurate readings, and so that changes, that is a micro change. There are also questions of not just deciding the internal order of the paragraphs in a specific fragment, but, and this is the major difference between the editions, deciding the relative order of the fragments. No? Which fragments go first, which go last, how shall we sequence the texts thematically, chronologically, and the four editors have given different answers to these problems. So this would be the edition, the 1982 edition. This would be the 1990 edition. So you can see that one of the strategies of this editor was to do away with the numbering of the fragments, so the text appears more continuous. See, she has done this for the whole book. This is the edition by Zenit, the 1998 edition. You see that there's an apparatus, a minimum apparatus, describing variants, describing features of the manuscript. And this is the latest edition, the Critical Genetic edition by Pizarro, the 2010 edition. Again, what I did here was I placed, actually the apparatus is in a different volume, but I placed it next to the text so that you could see how it works. So now that we've answered the question, what is the Book of Disquiet as an authorial project, and what is the Book of Disquiet as an editorial construct, the next question is, what is the Book of Disquiet as a virtual model, which is what we are trying to do. And I think I could answer this question in through three related points. The first one is that the Book of Disquiet in our archive, now the Book of Disquiet as a virtual model, is a performative engagement with textuality through self-conscious acts of reading, editing, and writing in the production of literary experience. So I'm not interested in doing a digital representation of the book that is only an emulation of the manuscript or an emulation of the critical edition. I'm interested in going beyond that and using the virtualization to think about what reading is, what editing is, what writing is. Second point, the digital virtualization of the Book of Disquiet explores the simulative capabilities and algorithmic process of the electronic medium in a way that deepens and transcends what has been achieved in similar projects, thus contributing for rethinking and remodeling the very processes of digital remediation. So my point here is that it's not enough to be representational. You have to explore the simulation. You have to explore the fact that digital encoding allows you to do different operations on the text, and that allows you to go beyond an accurate representation of the manuscript or of the critical edition. By integrating processability and participation, the computing environment created as a result of this virtualization will simulate the genetic and social dynamics of construction. So we can look at the writing process of the author, so the genetics of inscribing papers with pen or pencil or typewriter, but also look at the social dynamics of construction and look at the ways the editors went back to the papers and did their own arrangements and interpretations of what they saw in the documents. And so they constructed the book that was left unfinished by the author. And also to experimentally investigate the materiality of writing and the book in literary experience. And so ultimately, the goal is not so much to do a representation of the Book of Disquiet, but to use the remediation of the book to think about writing and think about the concept of book and the materiality of writing and the materiality of the book as defining elements in the literary experience of the text. So this is the fragment, one fragment written in July 1916, from which I stole the title of the project. So this is an example of a transcription. Now this is a fairly clean draft with a few, but I'll read you the text, and you will see how I read the digital dilemmas into Pessoa's 1916 project. No problem has a solution. None of us unties the Gordian knot. We either give up or simply cut it. We solve abruptly with feelings the problems of intelligence. And that is because we get tired of thinking, or because our shyness, or because of our shyness in taking conclusions, or our absurd necessity to find some kind of support, or our impulse to go back to others and to life. So you see here one of the leitmotifs of the book of Disquiet, which is this conflict between describing the world and participating in life. And so Pessoa and these heteronyms posit themselves as observers of the world, and so they withdraw from life now. And this is one of the themes of the book. As we can never know all the elements of a question, we can never solve it. To get to the truth, we lack enough data and intellectual processes that exhaust the interpretation of those data. So you can see that the data word unwittingly used by Pessoa just gave me the motto for the project. So this is a diagrammatic representation of the project. And you can see here the adoption of a form of editing that was, I think, first described by Jerome McGann in the 1990s, a form of editing that is called radiant editing or radiant textuality. So when McGann looked at the possibilities of electronic media for textual representation, he saw that we could think of texts in a way that was separate, that was independent from the hierarchical structures that had been inherited from the book culture. And so we could think of a radiant textuality in the sense that any element could lead to any other in a flexible and non-hierarchical way. And so one of the inspirations for the project was that idea of the radiant textuality. And so my intention when I conceived the project was that we would have like the topographic transcription related to the facsimiles of the original, so manuscript, typescript, and print. So on that side you have the authorial sources, and then you have the 4 major editions: Coelho, Cunha, Zenit, Pizarro. So these are the editions that we are encoding, the critical editions. This is the social construction of the book. But we would also have the virtual editing functionality. So the possibility of making new editions based on the history of the editions and on the authorial source. So the users could, on the basis of permutations and recombinations of the different fragments, which they would select either from the topographic transcription or from Coelho, Cunha, Zenit, and Pizarro, so based on 1, 2, 3, 4, and or 5, they could create new editions. And so experiment with the structure of the book of Disquiet. And so another diagram gives you the triple logic of the project. We want to represent the construction of the book by the author. We want to represent the construction of the book by the editors. So these are what I describe as the genetic dimension and the social dimension of the archive. And then we also want to represent the construction of the book by readers. And I've called this the virtual dimension. So the virtualization of the possibilities of organizing the book. When we describe the book from the perspective of its composition, we have a narrative of writing. When we describe the book from the perspective of its edition, we have a narrative of participation and reception. And finally, when we virtualize the book, we have an exploration of permutations of the writing process and the editing process in the production of versions. How is the archive structured? The archive is structured in two layers. One is what we call the static layer, and this contains the authorial witnesses and the 4 editions of the Book of Disquiet. So this is the scholarly level of the archive. In the future, we want to include reception of the Book of Disquiet, including book reviews of the major editions, essays about the work, research based on the archive, including a number of articles that we have produced, and also a selection of translations into several languages. So we've been in touch with a number of translators so that they allow us permission to select, say, 50 fragments from the book and present those 50 fragments in French, Spanish, Italian, Swedish. I don't know if there's a Swedish translation, but I guess there would be one. Yeah, there is one. So we would give it a more worldwide audience. Finally, we have a dynamic layer, which is the layer that contains the virtual editions created by users. In these virtual editions, users can select and organize fragments, assign them tags and semantic markers. These markers can be defined ad hoc, or they can be selected from a controlled vocabulary, or it's not mentioned. Yes, it's mentioned here. They can also be developed through computer-assisted tools. No, we use a topic modeling algorithm to generate tags. So a synthesis of everything. No, facsimiles represents the level of document, transcriptions the level of text, editions the level of book. So you read the document, it becomes a text, you organize it into a book. The first edition, Jacinto Prado Coelho, is represented in terms of individual transcriptions, also in terms of its overall structure, so the edited book. The same for the Teresa Sobral Cunha edition, for the Richard Zenith edition, for the Jerónimo Pizarro edition. Then you have our own edition, which has the facsimiles and has transcription, but it's not organized as a book, so it only works at those levels. And finally, you have the virtual edition, which is a description of the dynamic layer. You enter the archive and you rearrange on the basis of the corpus contained in the archive. You rearrange your own edition. So this we've covered. I'm just going to talk about the third point. What are the goals of the L2D archive? So creating a genetic perspective on the writing process, a social editing perspective on the construction of the book, and finally, to build a dynamic archive that enables both experts and non-experts to experiment with the production of further editions of the Book of Disquiet, and this is something that I've not mentioned until now, with the writing of further fragments based on the Book of Disquiet, thus using Web 2.0 collaborative affordances to allow readers to perform different literary roles. And so we are coming to the simulation and to the performative dimension of this archive. How are representation and simulation expressed in the archive? Representation is expressed through functionalities that enable users to see and compare textual transcriptions of authorial and editorial sources at different scales, from character to word to sentence to fragment to book levels. So the way we've codified the texts allow readers to compare differences at these different scales. So we can see every single difference, whether it's at the level of character, word, paragraph, fragment, or book structure. Simulation is expressed through functionalities that allow users to reconceptualize and rematerialize the work at editorial and authorial levels. So what is being simulated? Two processes. The writing process. Readers will be able to rewrite fragments, select a sentence, and write a variation based on that sentence. And readers are simulation also happens at the editorial level, because readers are able to create partial or complete editions of the book. So when I talk edition in this sense, when I refer to edition, I'm talking about any rearrangement of the source texts. Now let's go to the roles. Now, what roles can users perform in the archive? We have tried to think the performativity in terms of 4 functions. The reader function. So what is the objective of the reader function? Is to support a contextualized reading of the book of Disquiet, of the fragments. So by contextualized reading, we mean the ability of visualizing fragment variations across several authorial or editorial witnesses. So we do a reading, and we do a reading in context. So we are performing as readers. The editor function. The main purpose is to support interpretations of the book of Disquiet as a book project. This support must be achieved through the manipulation of metatextual information on the fragments and on the book of Disquiet as a whole. So here, what we envision is the possibility of, readers can make a search, an advanced search through the archive, and do that on the basis of certain themes, and that will generate a list of fragments, and then they can use that result to generate an edition. So they can generate editions on the basis of prior searches. They can also use taxonomies and create their own taxonomies, or do machine-assisted taxonomies and create editions based on those taxonomies. They can also read the fragments individually and decide that this fragment goes here, this fragment goes here, this fragment goes here, and so do a completely hand crafted edition. The book function, the main purpose of the book function is the reconstruction of the book of Disquiet based on predefined information. So these two functions, editor function and book function, are closely related. So we generate one of the aims of the editor function is to generate a book. No, so it's to actualize the book function. Finally, we have the author function. This is not implemented yet, but all the conception has been made for this function. The main objective of the author function is the extension of the book of Disquiet with new texts based on original fragments from the book. Thus, a reader is able to write a new text, becoming an author in the context of a virtual edition. So, virtual editions are not only editions based on rearrangements of Pessoa's texts, but they are also possible as rewritings of Pessoa's texts. So these are the 4 functions of the simulatory and virtual dimension of the archive. The reader function, the editor function, the book function, and finally the author function. And you can see that through these functions we are emulating the literary as a performance rather than as object that is independent of our own reading or of our own intervention, of our own construction. This is another diagram that more or less extends those functions. No? another one. So this shows how the virtual edition then feeds back into the archive, because any virtual edition created by a user then becomes part of the archive. And further users, new users, can create editions based on other virtual editions and not just on the original critical editions or on the original typographic editions. Which functions are already implemented? Now, so far, what we've done is to implement functions related to the authorial composition of the Book of Disquiet, on the selection and organization of fragments from the Book of Disquiet by the 4 expert editors. So these are the genetic and the social construction dimensions, and on the participation of users and the generation of new editions based on autograph and editorial materials contained in the archive. So one of the functions that we are still missing from the archive as the prototype is at this point is the author function, but we have plans to do that. I don't know if there's any computer science. Yes, so this will be more several computer scientists in the room, so this will be more familiar for you. I'm sure my friend Antonio Rito could explain this better than I can, but this is the data model of the archive, and you can see all the levels that I've described represented here in a way that is computationable. And again, another example, and another one. So this explains how the virtual edition relates to the fragments that are already in the archive. So how do we design a collaborative archive that achieves the right compromise between the expectations of experts and common users? On the one hand, through that separation, through those 2 layers, static layer and dynamic layer. On the other hand, through the idea of separation. Now, those editions coexist, but they are separate. So what I do in terms of creating virtual edition is based on the expert editions, it's based on the transcriptions and the encodings in the archive, but does not change those editions, does not change what's there. So virtual editions are built on top of other expert and virtual editions. Expert editions do not refer to virtual editions. Common users may explicitly decide to access the virtual editions. By default, only the expert editions are presented. So whenever someone comes into the archive, the default edition is always the expert edition. If he wants or she wants to see a virtual edition, it is necessary to make a specific decision to do that. So another, this is an archive that shows how the variation and the tags and the annotations work, so how they feed back into the edition. Another example, a description of the collaboration policy. And this is the diagram, more or less describing the workflow that we've established. What is a virtual edition in the context of the archive? A virtual edition is an edition created by users individually or as part of a community, based on the scholarly transcriptions of the fragments contained in the archive. The collaborative editors define their own edition by choosing and ordering the fragments. They can also annotate the selected fragments by means of tags and comments. So this is an example of what the virtual edition looks like. So we select, we order the fragments. We can also annotate through taxonomies that are ad hoc, so they are created by each user, or through assisted taxonomies. I'm going to skip these technical aspects here now, which is about the assisted taxonomy, and I'm going just to the last slide before I just show you the prototype. How can I play the author role in the LDD archive? So this is the next stage when we introduce the writing function. Author role is taken when the user chooses a fragment or a passage within a fragment, which we call source fragment, as textual basis for new acts of writing that will result in a new fragment for the book of Disquiet. The author function is not yet implemented in the prototype, but it is expected that the socialization of writing processes will satisfy the following conditions: selecting source fragments according to a specific edition, defining elements of the source text at different levels of granularity, word, group of words, complete sentences, entire fragment, defining degrees of human-machine collaboration in writing processes, from human writing using text editors to automatic permutations using text generators. One of our research fellows developed a generative work based on the archive. He called it Machines of Disquiet, and that work combines, according to different strategies, sentences from different fragments of the book of Disquiet. So this is an example of electronic literature tools being used in the context of the author function in the archive. We can also think in terms of more traditional HTML network, so placing anchors and links, and so the writing will point a derived fragment to its original source. So what was the word or the sentence or the fragment that was the point for that variation? Organizing new fragments, assigning heteronyms to new text. So heteronyms is a way of Pessoa referring to his several writing persona. So you can see an example, what would be a seed fragment, so a fragment from the book of Disquiet, and an extended fragment. The extended fragment would always contain a reference. So you could think of those highlighted sentences as specific references that would be taken by new writers to extend. So that first sentence, nenhum problema tem solução, no problem has a solution, that could be the beginning of a new fragment. And so user experimenting with the writing process would take that sentence and extend it and create a new fragment. So the idea is to use the book of Disquiet as a source for new thoughts and new forms of writing. So for those who are interested, I can send to Janet the articles that we've published. I think there was one that maybe can be circulated, a model for a virtual LDD. So these are the major research articles that we have published until now, and they detail different aspects of the project: the Ti encoding, the virtual modeling in terms of all these functions that I've just described, also the nature of the fragments. What is the fragment? What does it mean to say that the work is fragmentary? What notions of fragment can we find in this work? And I think there are several notions. Also, a new article about this idea of writing, experimenting with the process of writing as an element in the archive. So now, just to finish. So if you recall, let's go back to this fragment. So this is the fragment that we saw earlier. Sorry, the fragment that we saw earlier, and which contains these complicated writing kinetics. And what I'm going to show you is the encoding of this fragment. So the way we've encoded it, both in the authorial version and in the critical version. So what you are going to look at now is the TI, the transcription and the TI encoding of this manuscript and also of these 4 versions. So if you look at the encoding, you'll see that this fragment is entitled Coisas do Nada. So and we'll see that we are using only one file to encode everything. So all the editions are represented in this file. We have the reference here to the facsimiles, and then you have the transcription. And when you look at the transcription, you will see the extremely high number of variations that we have had to encode. And these variations are, in many cases, just orthographic. We are representing orthography as well, because 2 of the editors keep Pessoa's original orthography. The other 2 editors change the orthography and modernize the orthography. But there are also differences that have to, we are marking up, in the case of the original document, we are marking up the structure, the topography. So we are marking up line breaks, page breaks, spaces. And then there are differences that reflect the different arrangement of the paragraphs. So there are cases in which certain witnesses don't have the paragraph or don't have the paragraph in that position. And so all those variations are marked up. So you can see that this fragment has 1,251 lines when we add the encoding and the transcription of the source plus the 4 critical editions. So now let's go to the archive and see what we can do to this fragment. This is not the final interface. We are still working on the interface. So this is just the working interface. So this is the fragment that we've looked at. The system is interpreting the XML TI encoded file that we just saw. And what we have here is the list of expert editions, and on top the authorial source. So what we are looking at is the representation of the transcription of the authorial source. Well, this is difficult to manipulate because I will lose so it's you can't read it, but I guess you'll just have a sense of the mechanics of the thing. So when I talk about the genetics, I'm talking about the possibility of representing, for instance, let's see if this is working. Yes, this is working. No? So I light inserted, no? So you know that this is a word that was inserted. So it belongs to a process of revision of the text. Show deleted. I think there are deleted elements in here somewhere. Here, you see an example. No? And so in cases where there are substitutions, I'm not sure if this is the case. Let me just see if there is any substitution marked here. Yes, this is an example of a deletion and an addition, which means a substitution. So you can see that there are also marks for certain lines that Pessoa added to the manuscript. So these lines, Sometimes it's a question of spacing, sometimes it's a question of a ruler that may indicate the beginning of a new fragment, so the point where a piece of continuous writing that has some thematic unity gives rise to a new piece, to a new sequence. And you can see that this is the transcription following the kinetics of writing that we saw in that earlier diagram. And then when you look to the expert column here, editions, you will see that this is a very problematic fragment because it's been transcribed as only one fragment in Prado Coelho here. It's been transcribed as 2 fragments in Sobral Cunha. It's been transcribed as 2 in Zenith, and it's been transcribed as 3 in Pizarro. So they don't agree in terms of the division of that text, and there is also internal difference in terms of paragraph sequencing. Not the sequences are not all the same. So now we can compare. We can do what I mentioned as the compare. We can call the facsimile. Well, we can highlight differences. When we highlight differences, we know that this is a fragment that is different across the entire corpus. So no single paragraph. So the differences are not just at the word level, but also the paragraph level. So no single paragraph is maintained exactly in the same position in any of the editions. So these differences that are being highlighted here are differences across all of this corpus, all the editions and the transcription. But we can also compare our transcription with a specific edition. So you can see them here, like side by side. So all of the highlighted points are points of variation. In many cases, just orthographical variation, but they've all been encoded. So you can see that there are segments of texts that are highlighted, and this means that these are text sequences that are not in the same place, so they've been marked as differences across the fragment. So we can do this for any fragment. I will show you the other fragment, which is perhaps easier to understand because it's smaller, so no problem as a solution fragment. So in this case, you see that there aren't many differences. This is a fairly straightforward fragment. This is the topographic transcription, and we can compare across the corpus. So now we are comparing 3 editions, 4 editions, 5 editions. So all the 5 editions are being compared here. So the first sentence comes from here, the second from here, and etc. And we have the table of variations here. You can see that most variations are orthographic. So now let's see, for instance, I'm looking at the Teresa Sobral Cunha edition. Oh, I forgot to mention one thing, is that here you are not just seeing the fragments. This menu here allows you to navigate not just by looking at one specific authorial source as it's being transcribed and represented in these different editions. No? You can also see by the numbering the different places within the book. No? And if you go here, you can see the context of this fragment. So the fragment immediately before or immediately after in each edition. You can also, now I'm seeing Teresa Sobral Cunha, and I can see what's the fragment before this one, and what's the fragment after this one, so I can see the context, the immediate context of this fragment. I can look at the table of contents and see the full structure of the book. And so I always have access. So the idea, the radial structure that I was presenting to you earlier through that diagram means that I can always, independently of the fragment that I'm considering, I can always navigate to a representation of that fragment in any edition. I can navigate to the book structure where that fragment is present, and vice versa. If I'm seeing a particular edition, I can always go back to the archive and see the fragment outside that particular structure and see the fragment again in the context of the archive. So the book can be made and unmade through this process. So I'm navigating into the book and out of the book back to the archive. So what happens when I'm doing a virtual edition? So let's go back to the fragment where I was before. No, not this one. The other one, this one. No problem as a solution. So say that I want to make a virtual edition, and I'm looking at Richard Zenith's edition of this fragment. So this is the edition that I want. This is the edition from which I want to use a fragment for my own virtual edition. Let's suppose that this is my edition, class Y. These are the list of virtual editions. I can just add the fragment here. So this is one way of creating the virtual edition, but we also have an interface that has a series of tools to manipulate the edition from a table of contents, from the result of a search. So there are many ways of manipulating the fragments and making them part of a virtual edition. So I can add this fragment to my virtual edition. So the virtual edition of class X, of class Y. So is it here that I want to go? Let me just go here. Yes, the virtual edition of class Y has two fragments. One I've just added. Nenhum problema tem solução. And the archive, actually I don't think I've done it. Let me go back. So I'm using this one. Oh, maybe I did. So I've added, actually the fragment that I've added is referred to here as National Library. So this is, I've used the transcription of the authorial source, not the transcription of the expert editors. But let's say that now I am in my own virtual edition. And this is the annotation tool. Say that I want to select this, say this particular word, dados, data, that I want to add tags. So I could add a tag like, well, actually I've done it, so I'll show you the tags that I've added. Society, feelings, data, interpretation, self, intelligence. So these could be tags that are ad hoc tags that I create. And these tags could be, once I have tagged different fragments, they will be associated through the tagging. But the text could also be part of a controlled vocabulary that I offer users, and they can select tags and decide that this tag is adequate for this fragment, or the text could be generated through a topic modeling algorithm through an assisted taxonomy that we also have there. I can add a comment or a note like this fragment was originally used as the motto for the L2D archive project, something just to play with. And so what happens is that I could, through this process, gradually, incrementally, build an edition for specific purposes, teaching, research, for play, whatever. So this is the example of what the archive will also have several search functionalities, several visualization functionalities that will allow you to analyze certain features and show them through different kinds of visualization. And so you can see that the principle of separation is always you can manipulate the edition, the virtual edition, by adding participants, by creating a taxonomy. You can make the edition public. You can keep it private while you're working on it, etc. The edition could be something that you work, for instance, in a research context. You can do it as an exercise for learning about editing, for instance, or you can do it within different contexts. So I was mentioning, I don't know if I've mentioned this to Jenny before, but the book of Disquiet has become a major work. Now it's even introduced in secondary school syllabus. Now there are a few fragments that are recommended for reading in the 12th grade. So students could, with the collaboration of their teachers, they could select a few fragments and comment, tag them, organize them, experiment with them. So there's also a pedagogic aspect here, not just the research aspect. And actually, I think the archive could also be used for editors who want to prepare new editions of the book of Disquiet. And so expert editors could also make a very good use of this archive for rethinking the book of Disquiet.